I recognize a few people in the room. Welcome to the session. We've got 4 TIPS colleagues that are going to be presenting papers. And the theme of the first one is small business inclusive growth and just transition, which has been pulled up. Is that the first paper? Okay, okay. I wasn't sure if that was going to be the first one. Okay, so let's start off with that one, and that will be presented by my colleague, Dr. Neva MAKGETLA. I'm sure her bio is in the pack, but she's a senior economist at TIPS and has spent many years in policy making in various government departments, trade union, and also at WITS for many years and other academic institutions. Okay, let me hand over to Neva to present.
Wasn't at WITS for many years. I did academics elsewhere for many years. Okay, so the idea was to talk about small business inclusive growth and the just transition. And I will say what's interesting to me is in many ways it's drawing on the same insights Haroon had in the last session, if you were here, which is that really the shortfall in employment in South Africa is around self-employment. He said informal sector. I think we should be more specific. It's around self-employment, which could be formal or informal. Sorry. Apologies. Can I just take it off? Or? Okay, and so, but that's where the employment gap is, not so much in waged employment. So if we're trying to talk about the just transition and inequality, which is the theme of the conference, I think that the fundamental idea is that big business, people with money and resources and qualifications can usually find ways to mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis, or in fact to take advantage of new opportunities, which might include even escaping from wherever the problems are, either in terms of industries or in terms of regions. Less qualified workers in their communities often don't have the resources to do that. So the risk is that as the climate impacts get worse, it's the poor who bear the burden, and they're of course the least able to deal with it. It's particularly problematic in South Africa due to unusually deep inequalities, as we've been hearing. And the concept of the just transition actually arose to say then, how do we ensure that the burden of structural change and the crisis impacts don't fall mostly on the working class communities, on the low income group? And there are basically 4 main strategies that have come up to that. To do that, one is to say, how do we reduce emissions in existing producers so that we can sustain employment as far as possible, so we can avoid the structural change, as it were, which is always easier, although it doesn't always work. How do we get economic diversification, especially in the affected regions? Someone was saying we always fall back on Mpumalanga. There's a reason for that. The entire coal economy practically is in Mpumalanga. And so you have very targeted regional impacts there, whereas the regional impacts, for instance, on agriculture from droughts and floods, we don't really understand as well, like where they are. Because we're not very good at understanding the regional impacts of climate change still. The models are still all over, and the data sets are still fragmented. Social security is also important because you can't just assume people will find new livelihoods or employment opportunities. So that transitional phase, you really require significant social protection. And then what we often hear about active labor market policies. And I think one of the problems that we have is people like to say, well, why don't we just retrain everybody? But if the economy is not generating enough jobs already, and you're talking about people, when you say retraining, they may not have matric. They may have matric plus some very specialized skill. To act like they can simply walk into another job doesn't make sense. If we're not generating those opportunities, they're not going to get the kind of training probably, and I think we heard this from the previous session as well, that will enable them to simply create a new job. So the link, I would argue that for a country like South Africa with slow growth and a mono economy that's heavily focused on mining and commercial agriculture, economic diversion is the critical step. Okay, so really what we're talking about, what Haroon was talking about last session, is in effect we have a missing middle. That the reason we have very deep inequality is mostly because of this gap in self-employment, and this is just presenting what Haroon did in the last session in a different way. That sort of middle color blue, between the light and the dark, those are the self-employed or family members in family enterprise. And what you can see in South Africa is it's much less than elsewhere. And that's also reflected in the fact that productive assets and financial savings are even more unequally distributed than earned income. if we were going to get to the upper middle income level, you'd have to generate basically 2 million more enterprises. We'd have to double the number of small enterprises in South Africa. And that's a vast structural change. Remember, there's 16 million people employed now. So that's very significant. And I would argue we have 3 strategic options in the abstract. One is to say we're going to increase the number of family businesses. That would require big shifts in assets and infrastructure and government support programs, all of in, where people get inputs from, how we market things, all of those things. It's a very big change. The second thing is to have a massive increase in waged employment, which is really what we've always said we would do, but have been unable to. And the third one is to expand social grants or possibly collective ownership of existing companies so that people get a bigger share in the profits. Yeah? So in effect, a pure redistributive program. And by the way, we need to think more about the analogies between South Africa and a petrostate, because I think that's why redistribution looks so good. You've got highly concentrated economy with lots of resources being generated that can be redistributed. Okay, so why is there this backlog in self-employment? And this is where I think Haroon's paper could have had a stronger analytical basis, and we need to think about this more. And I would argue that firstly, there's that Hegelian dialectic about production and reproduction, that it was produced by apartheid, that on the one hand ensured dependence on the mining value chain and also commercial agriculture, but on the other hand was linked to the destruction of black-owned business, quite explicitly. And interestingly, both rural and urban. So if you look at the backlogs in self-employment, you can get the data rural and urban at the ILO stat data set. And the backlog is just as big in urban areas as in rural areas. Now, so it's not just the destruction of family farms, it's all family businesses. But you also have apartheid income differentials in employment, so that on the one hand, formal small business owners expect a much higher income relative to their employees than in other countries. And there's been research on this this is Palmer's research. No? But also it means that in working class communities, there's not a lot of demand. So it's very hard to start small businesses in townships or in formal settlements because people can't afford to pay. So the household income in the leafy suburbs is 4 to 5 times as high as in the townships. And that just generates more demand. Now, so you can't have to set up a restaurant someplace like Soweto, you have to find those middle class neighborhoods because most people can't afford to eat out. No? The question then is, so if apartheid structured this, why does it reproduce? Why does it persist? Almost 30 years since we ended apartheid. Well, one of the reasons is that the system entrenched these very unequal and also limited access to productive and financial assets, to education, to infrastructure, but also to experience. In other words, in other upper middle income countries, people's parents owned businesses and they learned how to run a business at home. That's much less likely to have happened here because of the way apartheid functioned. Those are things the market won't fix. The market tends to reproduce those things. You also have systems in both the government and the private sector that privilege capital-intensive activities in mining and agriculture. And you have, and we can go into how infrastructure and so on does that, if you like. But also, as we heard from Haroon, that also effectively limits small business, especially by not generating business and commercial sites or even keeping them away from business and commercial sites. There's issues around procurement and finance and also licensing, as Haroon talked about. If we look at the constraints on emerging businesses, again, the core question is, why didn't the end of apartheid lead to the reemergence of self-employment? And the answer that I'm giving is, apartheid destroyed the ecosystem that would support self-employment. And that means that government has to proactively engage to say, how do we get rid of those constraints on opportunities? And that doesn't mean just changing government regulations. It means proactively saying, what are the things that prevent people from being self-employed? So if you look at the production structure, we don't have much in the way of labor-intensive industries, and we have limited small-scale production in the dominant value chains. So if you look, for instance, at our reveal comparative advantage in things like plastics and clothing, we are so far behind the norm for upper middle income countries, it's amazing. We're like, the share in our exports for clothing is like 1/10 as high as it is for other upper middle income countries. And yet most countries, and the same for electronics, Most countries that have industrialized in ways that generate employment have been started with clothing, moved on to electronics and other things that generate employment on a mass scale. We're not doing that. We're growing the mining value chain and commercial farming, which don't create that many jobs. No? But also you've got the demand structure where you get into a vicious cycle where you have deep inequality that constrains household demand for basic goods and services. That makes it harder for people to produce on a small scale in a semi-formal way. And then you've got your entrepreneurs who could be entrepreneurs. They don't have money. They don't have productive assets. They don't have education often because our education system is still profoundly unequal. So for instance, in historically black schools, there's still twice as many learners per educator as in historically white schools. People don't, like I said, they don't get experience with their families. They don't have networks. They don't have infrastructure. Things that in other countries, people basically, their parents have always had. You know, and they just have to grow into that, and then hopefully they can find new opportunities. But we also have things like the generally slow economic growth, depressed demand in working class communities, issues around the gearing of procurement in both the public and private sector to large suppliers that makes it very hard to change these things. And if you look at market and government systems, like I said, they basically have historically prioritized support for farming and mining in a whole variety of ways, but also now with the new industrial policy, we're saying we're going to support relatively technologically advanced industries on the grounds that they could generate mass employment if we could ever get into export markets, but we're latecomers and we're very far from economic centers and it's not clear how we can compete there. And then finally, in terms of assets, it's still very concentrated, including small business and financial savings is still very concentrated amongst historically privileged people to some extent, but generally to people who have education and so on. Education itself is still unequal, which totally reproduces inequality in the long run. Limited experience of entrepreneurship, inadequate municipal services, or including for commercial and industrial sites that could serve small business. So if you live in Johannesburg like me, and one more minute, Saul, okay? Sorry. You know, you could see Deep Slut, like this big informal settlement growing very fast because Johannesburg doubled in size in the last 20 years. And initially they had not a single commercial site. You know, so you drive past there, there'd be nothing. And then about 10 years ago, they started building commercial sites. But you basically have hundreds of thousands of people living there, nowhere close to an industrial or commercial site. And then, of course, there's load shedding, which makes everything worse, particularly if you don't have the money to get a generator or solar, which is, of course, true for actual and potential small enterprise in most cases. So in effect, what we're saying is if we're serious about employment creation on a mass scale, including through self-employment, you need to look at what they call extensive growth rather than intensive growth, which means bringing more resources into production rather than saying we're just going to go for higher productivity and hope we can get into higher sales as the way we're going to grow employment. Because first, our experience is it hasn't worked, but secondly, it's just really hard to do when you're facing markets that are dominated by existing producers, particularly China, obviously, and the global north. So things you could do. We could vastly increase support for light industry and services of all kinds, but particularly often to serve domestic markets and the region where you're protected by distance. So not so much through tariffs, because if you're looking at basic necessities, that's hard to justify. But there are areas where we actually already export quite a lot to the region, as well as having domestic demand, like for processed foods, like pasta. You can look at smallholder agricultural schemes, but you'd have to say, how do you set up holistic support, like those contracting schemes they do in sugar and forestry? You could say, how can we set up platforms for crafts? Can we roll out ECD? Can we set up venues for business in formal commercial sites for small business? So that people could have, for instance, pop-up shops at the malls, or have fruit and veg open markets near the malls. Whereas now, as Haroon was saying, it's very hard to get into those things. You can also say, how do we subsidize goods and services in ways that generate demand for small business? Because if working class people can't afford them, you both be raising living standards and hopefully kicking into motion a virtuous cycle. And to be clear, we have a lot of these programs, but they tend to be on a really tiny scale. So if you're talking about structural change in the economy, you need to be talking about hundreds of thousands or millions and not, hundreds or dozens. And part of the issue is, if we're looking at the just transition, how do we say these kinds of programs have to be part of that economic diversification effort, or you could just aggravate existing inequalities? And really where we end into a policy fight is in two places. Firstly, a lot of people in South Africa would say this kind of small business, it's not productive, it's, informal, it's not good, because by definition, informal uses bad technology. And it can never be globally competitive. And wouldn't it be nice if we could just build globally competitive industries on a scale that will generate employment? Yeah? So this is definitely second best for many economists, just because productivity is always good. And so I think we have to think about, how do we think about that? The second thing is, it's structural change, it's disruptive, it's risky. Yeah? Like, you can fund a lot of small entrepreneurs and most of them will go broke. You can set up schemes to support small entrepreneurs, it can be done. It's hard to do it on scale, and it takes years for it to become sustainable, if it does. Yeah? But I would argue it's necessary and viable, and honestly, the alternative, in my personal opinion, is more social grants, and maybe that's what we should be doing. It's certainly what we are doing. But I think we need to think about, is that the best, the best option from any, I would argue that's third best, but it's the easiest one in terms of the political economy. Thanks, sorry, I went on too long. Oh, sorry. I had something else there. Oh, okay. We have to say, what should the end of the just transition look like?
Thank you, Neva. A lot of insights in a very short period. You threw. I'm sure you could have, but I've heard you. Okay, there is a full paper on the TIPS website if you want to go into the detail, but it does give insights as to some of the key issues that we need to be thinking about if we want to structurally change our approach to supporting small enterprise, and the importance of that. Our next speaker, we'll do questions, so note them down. We'll do it after everyone, just so that everyone can get a chance to talk. We are keeping everyone to about 12, 13 minutes, so that we have a chance to have some discussion. It's always nice to have discussion at the end of these sessions rather than just listen to people presenting. Okay, our next speaker is Nokwanda MASEKO, also from TIPS. Well, the whole panel is, so I don't need to keep saying that. She's a senior economist at TIPS, and she's going to be talking about unemployment and sustainable livelihoods.
Afternoon, colleagues. Yeah, this feels like a poetry session, but one of those slam. No, I'm not gonna start doing a slam poem. So yeah, as Saul already said, I am Nokwanda MASEKO. I am a senior economist at TIPS, and so this presentation essentially comes from a paper that I did for the PCC as part of the Just Transition Framework document that we were working on. And just as a disclaimer, you will see in the two graphs that I have combined colored and Asian. And that's not to say that there's any sort of homogeneity between the two groups, but it's just as a data thing, like if I separate them, then the data becomes very difficult to look at, just because of how small those groups are. And so by way of context, I mean, I think we already know that, the just transition is here. And part of the reason I wrote this paper is the fact that most of the time when we talk about the just transition and how to protect people, we tend to look at people who are in paid economic activity, and that essentially lives out a very big chunk of South Africans who are not in any paid economic activity, and if they are, then they're generally poor. And as I said, this comes from papers that we've worked on before, and what we've done as part of the sector jobs resilience plans was look at value chains. And as I was thinking through that work, I was worried about the fact that if we do focus on these value chains, what about the people that are not in any value chain whatsoever? And considering also the fact that, we are all going to feel the impacts of the climate crisis, but those who are going to be affected the most are those without the resources to build any form of resilience because they don't have the economic resources. And so this paper essentially then focused on trying to figure out who those people are and, coming with interventions that could be implemented. And so this first graph looks at, employment status of people, and you will see the differences between these two graphs that I've got here and the ones in the paper. These are updated, so this essentially then shows us the employment status from 2019 to 2021, and so it takes into consideration the impact of COVID as well. And as you can see with the red boxes there, that's a representation of African men and African women, and you can see that especially African women have the lowest rate of employment at around, I believe it's just under 60%. Yeah, under 50% as of 2021. And that compares to around essentially 90% for white men. And so that gives you a very broad picture of, who has the economic resources and who does not. And what I see here is that, generally unemployment is highest amongst those who are aged between 20 and 39. And also when you look at the high unemployment rates, you also realize then, especially again for African women, we'll also refer to them as Black women because I'm used to that also. Those people generally tend to not have work experience. And when they do have work experience, they would have worked in retail or wholesale trade, for example, where the wages are generally low. Come on. And then the other thing that I looked at, which, links to what Neva was talking about earlier around household spending, for example, what we see here, and you will see in the report as well, that there's a graph that looks at income sources. So I didn't include that one here. I wanted to look at the expenditure and so the buying power of different households. And essentially what I found is that generally those in Black women-run households, generally the majority of them, almost 92%, tend to live below 10,000 Rand a month. Those numbers are vastly different for those who are in white men-headed households, for example. And that essentially reflects also, income sources for people. So as you will see in the paper as well, that generally those in Black women-headed households tend to rely on either remittances or grants, whereas those in colored or Asian men-run households, or like white men-run households, for example, generally tend to rely on, salaries, wages, business income, as well as pension. And that's not like a social grant, but like pension from, retirement and stuff like that. And so when you look at how much these households spend, it generally gives you a picture of how much resources people have and how much they're able to then build their own resilience within their household level. And you will also then see some of the age and skills education as well in the rest of the paper. But I think the last important point I wanted to make here also is we tend to take for granted, right, especially around property ownership. So we look at who owns properties, and we've actually, what was interesting for me was that generally Black women, more than any other group, tends to own their house. But the problem there is that the value of that property is generally low, so below 500,000, for example. Whereas with white men who have a generally low property ownership level, that's because their properties generally are around R1 million compared to less than 500,000 for Black women, for example. And so even with that property ownership amongst Black women, there is a limitation to what you can do with the property. If it's, for example, an RDP house, or if it's a shack, there's limitations around what you can do with that property. And why do we need to know all of this? It's important because for the transition to be inclusive, I think we need to think beyond the idea that we need to protect those that are going to lose jobs. We also need to protect households who are going to be affected by the biophysical impacts of climate change. And we've seen generally looking at weather events like floods, for example, there's a lot of migration happening as a result of that, and there's a lot of displacement happening as a result of that. And so our interventions to protect people at a household level generally then need to focus on some of those issues rather than just simply focusing on providing jobs for those who are likely to lose jobs as a result of the transition. And so thinking through the interventions, as I mentioned, the jobs generally are going to be looking at people who are going to likely lose jobs as a result of the transition. And so at household level, and especially for poor communities, what can be done? And some of the interventions here focus around, climate-proofing infrastructure, for example. So we know that the state has a public housing program. Can that program actually be used to provide climate-proofed housing, as well as making sure that infrastructure that communities use and households use is climate-proofed, including, for example, roads? And so when you look at the RDP program, for example, there is funds obviously there to fund housing. How much of that money can actually be directed to building climate-proofed houses rather than living people in shacks where we know that those are going to be damaged? And so those households are essentially going to be left without a home, but also without resources for them to be able to find another home. And then the other intervention is around the public provision of, low carbon public transportation. So we know that generally provinces and cities across municipalities, they have public transport infrastructure like buses, for example. Can we actually provide low carbon buses such that, people can move around more or less, but also know that we are reducing emissions across the country? And then there's also, rollout of other low carbon technologies. And the idea here is not so much that, you provide this infrastructure, but you're looking at ways to also create employment and create, small businesses, as Neva was talking about. Because this is not just about using the current materials that we have, but we also then need to start thinking clearly about what low carbon building technologies are necessary. For example, where can we invest in people that are already doing some of this innovative work to actually make sure that as we're also moving towards low carbon technologies, we're also creating jobs and small businesses. And then I think the other major one is a redistribution of public investments. Almost forgot I was not in Gauteng. I was about to say that, in Gauteng, here in Gauteng. But generally, I think as a country, with the exception of the Western Cape, which is another country in itself, we generally tend to think of South Africa as existing solely in Gauteng. And so when you look at the distribution of public investments, it's mostly limited to Gauteng, which is partly why we're facing now, a housing crisis in Gauteng. But we're also then facing a shortage of employment opportunities. And that's largely the result of not investing in other provinces. Yes, we have SEZs here and there now, but generally when you look at what infrastructure is available in those provinces, when you look at what opportunities are available in those provinces, they're generally low. And so you find that there's actually a lot of people migrating to Gauteng because that's where the opportunities are, but that essentially then means that all the other provinces, there's just underinvestment. And the concern here is that as we're worried about making sure that everyone in Gauteng, everyone who's going to move to Gauteng has housing, has a job, we're then neglecting the other provinces that are also going to need not just regular infrastructure, but climate-proofed infrastructure as well, because there are still people living in those provinces. And so we need to think clearly about how to redistribute public investments. And so, in conclusion, I think you've heard from my presentation that generally inequality in South Africa is racialized and gendered. And generally, what that means is that Black women are most likely to be left behind in terms of, being able to gather an income, being able to protect themselves against the impacts of climate change. And so, we need to think clearly about what can the state and, everyone who's in this room, who's having this conversation, can we think clearly about what a just transition looks like for those people that are not in paid economic activity? And what are the things that we can actually do to include those people rather than, just focusing on people that are going to lose employment, that are going to lose their businesses? Because as I said, the impacts of the transition and the impact of climate change is not just about job losses, it's also about the loss of resources that households have. And so, what can we do as part of the transition to protect those households? And yes, I know generally the consensus is that we can't be using the transition as a fix-all thing, but I think if we're not going to have that conversation, then we're going to continue to re-entrench and to deeply entrench the inequality that exists now. And so, in 50 years, whatever, we're going to be having the same conversations around inequality in South Africa. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nokwanda. I think the two issues of building resilience comes through in both presentations, and also generating more economic opportunities becomes so important for how we're thinking about these issues. Our next presentation is by Seutame, who is also an economist at TIPS, and he'll be presenting on the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, but as a proxy, I assume, for all border adjustment mechanisms that are coming our way. And this, we're not going to see only this one. I'm sure there'll be more. But it's an important area on how we get it right and the risks of it exacerbating inequality. Over to Seutame. Thank you.
Thanks, Saul. So my name is MAIMELE Seutame. So I'll be taking you through what the carbon border adjustment mechanism is and how it's going to impact South Africa, as well as, for example, other implications that might come with the introduction of such mechanisms in the continent as well. So I'm not going to take that much time. So firstly, I'll just give you the overview of what CBAM is and how that will impact the country as well as the continent, and how can we respond to some of these mechanisms that are actually coming up now. So just to give you a bit of context in terms of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, so it is actually part of one of the policy instruments that the European Union is actually introducing through what they call the European Green Deal. So we've seen now already, globally, especially looking at developed countries, they are introducing green deals or policies that looks into moving towards low carbon economies. So as part of the European Green Deal, there's the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a carbon border tax, tax that is taxed on the exports that you send into some of these jurisdictions, right? So based on the emissions of for example, iron and steel and the like. So the emissions that are emitted in the production process needs to be accounted, and you have to pay for that through tax. So in a nutshell, I think the carbon border adjustment mechanism is, just to simplify this, is a tax that is taxed on GHG emissions of product, right? So it was also included in the European Green Deal to also fast track the transition of the European Union, right? So, and of course, the main thing is to also raise revenue, through the mechanism so that they can fund the decarbonization journey of the European Union. And what we've seen is that there's also a lot of developments happening now. So the US, the UK, Canada, even now recently Australia, they're looking to have such mechanisms in place. So we start to see a worldwide rollout of some of these conversations. So and now I'm just gonna take you through how some of this will might have an impact, but specifically looking at the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism. So there are sectors that are included now in the CBAM. So there are 6 sectors, adding up to 42 product lists. So some of those sectors are electricity production, cement, fertilizers, iron ore, hydrogen, and as well as aluminium, right? So those sectors are considered high emitting sectors, and that's why they've targeted that those products initially. But the scope of the products will actually start expanding as time goes by. All right, so um, just to give you a bit of context, so the CBAM, the EU CBAM, is going to be implemented in 2 phases. So it's gonna be first phase, which is the transitional phase, which has already kicked in from the 1st of October, and during this period, entities or firms exporting, for example, iron and steel, cement, and the likes, they will start to monitor as actually also to report the GHG emissions to the European Union. And the last phase, which is the implementation phase, that's where taxes will start to be paid after that. So there is a lot of engagements already in the CBAM space. I think generally, even considering others, mechanisms that are being developed globally. So in the African context, what you see here is that we've done analysis, and I think there's already been several studies that have tried to quantify the impact of CBAM in the African continent as well as in South Africa now. So what you see is that the aluminium, specifically iron and steel and fertilizers, are some of the sectors that are will be highly impacted by the introduction of CBAM, the European Union CBAM. And there was a study that was done by the African Climate Foundation, the LSE, which they considered that, for example, if there's a development of some of these mechanisms, for example, in the US, the UK, and the likes, then the cost or the continent will start losing a lot of revenue in that case, and they project that at least $39 billion annually in the African continent would be lost due to the introduction of some of these mechanisms. Then from there you will start to see that actually the impact in the African continent is spread between North Africa and Southern Africa. So what you see here is that Tunisia, Morocco, and Egypt, in the northern side, then they will be highly impacted. Then in the southern side, you see Mozambique and South Africa coming out strong in that space there. Right. So just looking specifically in the South African case, what you see is that, of course, the same trend is you can see that aluminium and iron and steel will be highly impacted in the space, and you see, considering that there might be other African countries that are also impacted, but in South Africa specifically, you start to see that there's a lot of other issues, which are another issue, which is of importance here is the carbon intensity. So especially looking at the graph here in red there, you see South Africa, as much as it doesn't export a lot of goods, especially in the metal sector, is one of the highly carbon intensive country, which will become a problem now, especially if other jurisdictions start introducing mechanisms such as the CBAM. So, but considering the recent so it was adopted already, so the mechanism has already been adopted, and we've done an analysis to try to quantify the impact of CBAM in South Africa. And from what you see on the screen is that about 53 billion rands are actually at stake here due to the introduction of CBAM. and you'll see there, for example, it's about 10% of all South African exports that goes into the EU, and that translates to about 2.2% of total South African exports. So these are some of the issues that we currently facing due to some of the these mechanisms that are being introduced elsewhere in terms of impacting our inputs. So just to give you like more problems that are coming out due to the introduction of this mechanism is that the main point of the main thing that comes across is that the introduction of carbon border taxes, they increase the cost of exports, which translate to making the exports that comes from everywhere else to be less competitive to enter some of those markets. So what we see even in the South African case is that the South African export will start to increase in terms of cost based, on, for example, on operational cost increases due to that the entities that, for example, if you're exporting iron and steel and cement, then you'll need to have a system in place and a carbon accounting system in place where you need to account and report those GHG emissions, and it's quite expensive to have that system in place. So you'll start to see that operational costs will start increasing in the space due to firms expected to have those systems in place, later on reducing the profitability of firms, and there's a high risk of that we expecting that there might be some jobs that will be lost in the space. So already in the UK, so they've tried to they are saying they're moving from production process, the blast furnace production process in the iron and steel, to a more electric arc. So that basically means that they're moving away from a high emitting production process to a less emitting production process. Then in that space there, and what they already highlight is that at least 2,000 to 3,000 jobs are expected to be lost just in the iron and steel sector now, due to the need for us to move away from carbon-intensive, sectors, right? So there's job risks that comes with that, and what we've seen recently is that there's a lot of iron and steel imports that are coming into the country because now, for example, maybe other countries, primarily in the EU and the likes, they are moving away from their markets and coming into markets that don't have, for example, climate change policies or ambitious climate change policies or carbon pricing in place. So that increases the possibility of carbon leakage. So in the African continent, we know that the continent doesn't have a lot of, for example, doesn't have climate carbon pricing. So South Africa is the only country that has that. So there's an increased risk of carbon leakage. We'll start to see a lot of entities moving from jurisdictions that don't have climate change policies and coming to relocate here for the production processes, and later on finding markets that don't have climate change policies. So there is an increased risk in terms of that as well there. But just based on the exposure, so we've noticed that actually there's a lot of people or even entities, they are not well aware of the mechanism. So I think for starters, we need to start increasing awareness in that space so that people can start engaging and knowing, the potential impact of CBAM and CBAM-like measures that might come in the future. So that should be like the first thing that we need to do. But in the immediate term, I think what we need to do is that, we need to respond to CBAM. For example, CBAM requires that firms need to have, the accounting systems in place. So at the moment, most entities don't have that. And I think there's a need for us to create a more integrated system where, we can allow, for example, entities or firms to report GHG emissions even at the product level as is required under CBAM, right? And of course, I think industries as well, they need to start, increasing or retrofitting their business models to, include green strategies, or even increasing the investment in green technologies or cleaner technologies, so that later on they don't have to pay a lot of tax in that space. So I'm not going to touch a lot on this lot of interventions, but I think just to cut it short is that my last point or my recommendation is that there is also a need to increase the carbon tax in South Africa at the moment. So the South African carbon tax is quite low by international standard, but in that process, we need to also consider some of the other socio-economic aspects that might come in terms of increasing carbon tax in South Africa now. But the increasing of carbon tax will actually try to, in a way, reflect the international standards, so that once we pay it into the EU, then we can get some sort of like rebates or even, internalized revenue that might come with increased tax. So I will just leave it there, but yeah.
Okay, thank you, Seutame. The lots of complex issues. Again, the full paper's on the website. It's trying to capture quite an important area in a few slides, but it does point to potential risks for South African industry, and because of how our industry is structured. But also the linkage to Neva's paper and what Nokwanda is saying, the need for diversification of our economy starts to then become even more important as we face these future challenges. Our next paper is by Gaylor, MONTMASSON-CLAIR, who's going to be presenting on policy primers for the just transition. Oh, there it is. I didn't need to look at my phone. Gaylor's also a senior economist at TIPS, and after his paper, we'll have a chance for some discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Saul. And good afternoon, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be here today. And because we're all from TIPS, there'll be a little bit of repetition, but I think it's good. Always good to repeat the same message a little bit more. Like Nokwanda's paper, this is an input that I prepared to inform South Africa's Just Transition Framework that was developed by the PCC. And so, if you read the framework, you'll be familiar with some of the kind of the flavor of effectively of the presentation. I think the first thing really to think about when we think about Just Transition for me is about where are we now and where do we want to be tomorrow? And we all have those grand visions about 2030 or 2040 or 2050. It's always the same wording around, environmentally sustainable, climate resilient, low carbon, just society. But then we revert back in terms of, okay, where are we now? And obviously we're nowhere near where we want to be. And so it tells us that there's quite a journey between now and tomorrow, assuming that we want to get there. And so one of the premises of the Just Transition is that actually the journey matters as much as the destination. Yes, we're important to focus on our end goal, but actually how we get there is really fundamental. And so, I feel like sometimes we jump too quickly to our end state without actually thinking about how do we achieve that. And of course, when we talk about Just Transition, one of the key things is that people, communities, companies, but also countries have different abilities to respond and adapt to disruption. You can't necessarily control disruption. It's coming. Shocks are always coming. In this case, it comes from a technological transition. It takes some policy changes, some climate change. But how we respond to that is important. And when we think about the Just Transition to a green economy or a low carbon economy, the first thing to be very clear about is that if we're not within a climate compatible world, so let's say a 1.5 degree world, it's virtually impossible to achieve a just transition. And so that's really an important premise on which to think about and include any discussion around just transition. A business as usual trajectory around climate cannot achieve a just transition. And again, that's really important to remember that. Then, of course, the just transition paradigm is really focused on vulnerable stakeholders. And it says, in a nutshell, that we don't want vulnerable stakeholders to be negatively affected by the transition. And in some cases, some people say, well, actually, it should even be that they're better off through it. But at the basis, at least, is that they shouldn't bear the brunt of the transition. How do we think about those vulnerable stakeholders? There's many ways to think about it. If we think about it through employment, for instance, this is one way. There's many other ways to look at it. You can think in terms of industries that are going to be impacted and shrink, and where are those located. So that's why we think a lot about Mpumalanga Gap, because a lot of the coal-based commissions are based there. But you can also think in terms of the employments that you have. You could be in an industry that's growing, but your type of employment is actually disappearing. Or you may be in an industry that's actually shrinking, but actually you are in demand as an individual because you've got the right skills, and then you're not necessarily vulnerable. And then of course the third parameter here is the sort of what I call a quality of employment, but effectively it comes down to kind of the safety nets that are available. How much resources do you have? What's your resilience level? Because again, if there's lots of safety nets, you're not as much at risk. So there's other ways to look at that, but that's just one way to think about it. Then I think we kind of have to talk about what do we mean by just transition. And I think that is a big thing in South Africa that we need to really tackle. Everybody talks just transition, and everybody has the right words, and they might even have the right words on the slides or in the annual report or whatever the case may be. But once you start scratching the surface and say, well, what do people actually mean by just transition? What do they want to achieve? And let me straight here, there's no right or wrong. It's just that we need to decide what we mean by it. I think there's not like there's one person that's got a better answer than another. We all have a different understanding, but we need to have a common understanding. And so it's a very simple depiction of kind of the levels of ambition that can be associated with the term just transition. There's a lot of people who actually mean just transition, but they don't want a transition, and they think that achieving status quo will be a just transition. Some people argue, well, it's just about maybe addressing some of the consequences of the transition. So, one person loses their job, we'll try and find another job for that person. Whereas certain groups argue that we need to address the consequences, of course, but then we also need to look at the roots of the problems. And so a lot more ambition into the vision. And so that is important to start analyzing what people mean when they talk about just transition. At the core, there are three dimensions that have been conceptualized, forming the basis of just transition. One is procedural justice or participatory justice. So it's about the process, making sure that the decision-making around just transition is inclusive. One is distributive justice. It says, effectively, if you're negatively impacted, or all the negative impact of the transition should be addressed and should be cushioned. And then the last one, which is quite fundamental in the South African context, but actually ignored in most of the world, actually the whole entire global north, even the most leftist people in global north don't even talk about restorative justice, because again, they have a very different context. But in South Africa, the restoration and addressing some of the crucial inequalities that you've heard already is fundamental. And so the just transition agenda can do that somewhat. So if we think about the three kind of levels from a policy perspective and some of the mechanisms that can be used to achieve a just transition, let's look at procedural justice first. Here, the premise is that you can only have an inclusive outcome if you've got an inclusive process. Okay, so it really is a premise that the people at the core of the just transition must be involved into it. Very nice idea, very hard to do in practice, of course. It's about involving the people at the core into the decision making, but also bringing resources. It's not just one thing to invite them to a meeting and say, well, you were consulted. How do we do that and empower people to actually take part into processes, bring their own evidence, their own voice, how we are transparent into those processes, and how to make sure that there's accountability and trust. Again, it's very difficult to do, and it takes a lot of time if you're going to do that properly. So I think we obviously have a mix of more direct democracy and representative democracy to do that. What is clear from a South African perspective is that, look, we've got quite a rich background and history of bottom-up democracy, but a lot of that has been eroded over time. A lot of the structure that existed and still exist don't have the same strengths that they used to, and and that's true from some of the government processes, that's true from some of the consultation processes, but also some of the sort of community organization and so forth. But certainly, there's a lot of existing channels that we can leverage. You know, I would say that most of the channels that we need are actually in existence in the system, either in law or in actual concrete terms, but they're not necessarily utilized to that extent. And so how we kind of revive things like what committees, do we do meaningful consultation on the ground, and how do we try to do co-creation in a meaningful way, which is not just asking people what they want out of the blue, because, well, if you just do that, most probably they don't know, or the other way around, which is coming with ready-made solutions that you want them to rubber stamp. Again, if you're going to do co-creation, it's possible, but it takes time. You know, and so I think we have to sort of see how we do that. Secondly, if we look at distributive justice, the first tool that's always kind of used to address with things like loss of employment, for instance, is labor market policies, which you have in terms of, you know, active and both passive. And again, the tools are known and very, you know, experienced and tried and tested. But importantly, labor market policies, you know, only really work in an environment where you have low unemployment, you got relatively high job creation and economic dynamism. Sadly, this is not the situation that we're into. And so, you know, they are important, but they're only one part of the puzzle. And I think that's really, again, important to acknowledge that we have those tools. We implement them already in South Africa, and for most of them, or we've tried them before, but on their own cannot solve our problem around distributive justice and address all the issues around employment and livelihood. So that means that, you know, if it's only one part of the puzzle, then industrial policy becomes critical to create new opportunities and sort of revitalize regions, value chains, and create new opportunities. And again, the tools here are known and have been tried, you know, both when it comes to some of the more horizontal industrial policy, which looks at some of the market infrastructure and market structures, and some of the more targeted tools like, you know, tariff and finance and other sort of value chain specific interventions. They have been tried, but what we see in our context is that there's not a lot of coherence, certainly when it comes to the just transition. You know, we are pulling in a lot of different directions, at times in opposite directions, which obviously is not very productive. And so how do we get a coherent strategy, particularly for, you know, impacted areas or impacted value chains or impacted groups, is really important that we think about that. Of course, that applies to the transition to a green economy, but it also applies to other sectors that just may be neutral, I guess, in their impact and have to transition. But again, then, you know, looking at labor market policies, look at people that are employed, industrial policy will create jobs, but I think, you know, Nokwanda was talking about a lot of people who also just are not employed, you know, and so here, I think social protection is becoming obviously a critical aspect. And again, you know, both through contributory and non-contributory social protection, we have a lot of the tools, and we actually have quite a widespread, you know, social protection system in the country, but it has, of course, a lot of gaps in terms of coverage, and it's the levels of the protection and the safety net that often are not enough. And certainly they're not enough to provide a genuine safety net to be resilient. And that is a challenge. So again, we have the tools, but how do we apply them? Maybe to specific contexts, like coal workers or particular communities, maybe, and then we can ramp up, is a critical question. Lastly, restorative justice, as I mentioned, a critical aspect in the South African context, of course. And this is where really the just transition paradigm starts to become really transformative, but it is also where it becomes difficult to put a boundary. Because if you're trying to achieve everything through one intervention, then you are diluting your potential impacts. But it is important to start looking at things like empowerment and you know, restoration on multiple levels. And so how we use the just transition agenda, at least to potentially trial things in particular groups or areas or value chains, like it's done in other countries, I think it can be very powerful. And I know then it raises some political economy questions, because why choose co-workers over another community that would be maybe in Northern Cape, and that is more impoverished by some standards. It is difficult, but I think it is an avenue to use and then trial potential answers in terms of restoration going forward. So in conclusion, what we see is that, you know, in the South African context, just transition, I would say, is very much in the making. We have a lot of understanding already. It's not true that we don't have any understanding. We don't have all the answers, but I think we know who a lot of the vulnerable groups are. We know a lot of the tools that we can use. We've tried some of them, but we need to do a lot more implementation and actually just find the building blocks so that we can move forward, and then we'll figure out some of the other answers, I think, as we go as a country. But the crux, I think, for me is about starting to implement a lot of those things, and then, you know, we will see if we have the right political will, then and we can align against the vested interest between stakeholders, then we would have a shot then of achieving a just transition. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I was putting pressure on you, but you were running out of time. Again, a lot covered in a very short presentation, and a lot to think about, because I mean, one of the issues that struck me from a documentary that we did about just over a year ago, looking at the just transition, was one of the workers saying, but what about my children? You know, people who aren't necessarily worried about themselves, they're getting close to retirement, or they'll find a way of making things work, but they can't see any future employment for their kids. And I think that comes through in how we think about some of those elements of the justice and some of the policy levers that we may have to intervene in communities, particularly very impoverished communities that can't easily just walk away and vote with their feet. They're stuck there. They have to deal with the realities of the poverty that's going to be coming, and the worsening inequality. I see we have 2 mics roaming. We have about 15 minutes. We'll have a few questions. If you can, introduce yourself, where you're from, targeted at a particular presenter, so we don't have all 4 presenters talking. And then after that, I'll give each presenter 30 seconds standing on one leg to conclude and wrap up. And I did this at a conference the other day, and I went 2.5 minutes over, and the program director said I want 2.5 minutes from each presenter. So it was my fault, and they actually wanted 10 minutes back, but that wasn't possible. Okay, so hands, comments, as well as questions. Okay, let's start over here, then we'll go over there, then Sean, and then here. Your marker's not marking.
Is it any different?
Yeah, we can hear
Okay,
you.
now I can hear myself. So I'm from the CST, our Center for Sustainability Transitions, and my question is for Nokwanda. You mentioned a couple of interventions like low carbon transport, climate proofing infrastructure, and low carbon tax, and all of this talks to needing quite a bit of money. And then you also said that, you know, we need to redistribute public or public investments. But I think in light of some of the social disparities that we already covered today, we can safely say that wherever that money is sitting is probably closing some other social disparity. So my question to you is, do you see a role for industrial policy in unlocking other types of funding and finance rather than just government or public funds? Because clearly that's not enough. And then, can I ask one more question?
Okay, keep it short if you can.
Okay, so this one is for Seutame. When you covered the CBAM, the CBAM policy and the implications it has for South Africa, and you also mentioned how local firms need to decarbonize in order to be competitive and actually survive. But we know South Africa The manufacturing, for example, has been quite stagnant, and this is also from a report that was published by TIPS. So it's not doing great, so they're not making lots of money. So what are you seeing in terms of actually having funding and financing for them to actually decarbonize and be globally competitive? What options do you see for them for actually having the fixed investment requirements to invest in themselves to decarbonize when the market isn't so great for them right now?
Okay,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Can you hear me? Yeah,
Yeah.
brilliant. Antoine Godin from the AFD headquarters in Paris. Two questions, comments, one for Neva. First of all, thank for all the presenters. It was really interesting. One question for Neva. I think I don't want to add too much pressure on industrial policies, but I think if you will make a connection with the low carbon transition, it's crucial. And I'm currently helping Morocco in designing their low carbon transition. And I think what we've seen is that if you get to target specific goods that are potentially going to grow, the demand will grow in the context of a low carbon transition, either in Morocco or in Africa in general, or in the world in general. This can help in targeting specific sectors where you think the country could develop industries. And I think so that can help, can be done as either also by doing this, creating a market for these goods. And I think this is something that might add to the recommendation you were proposing. And a quick comment to Seutame. I think your assessment of the CBAM is extremely interesting. You might want to consider the indirect effect that the CBAM might have on the industrial policies. So instead of targeting only the directly impacted sectors, you might want to look at the sectors that are producing goods that are being used by those impacted sectors, because then you can see that actually the impact might be much larger in the case of South Africa for all of the industries that are not necessarily carbon intensive, but are producing goods that are used to produce carbon intensive goods. And if you want to have some references for that.
Sean at the back there. And then
Thanks very much, Sean Muller, Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. Brief comment, which I guess is a background to the question, and then the question. The problem with the conceptions of just transition that are being used, including here, is that either, and this is a point my co-author and I made at the TIPS conference last year, either they're too narrow and they focus on industrial policy and jobs, or they're too broad, the Swilling type conception, where somehow we're going to use the just transition despite all the difficulties to like transform society. And there's a gap in there. We'll have a paper coming out on that. But linked to that is this issue of procedural justice. It seems to us that the procedures that are being followed are really rubber stamp, that many of the institutions involved, with all due respect, including TIPS, are basically going through a process to justify decisions that were made about the appropriate policy ex ante. So I think if we're going to talk about procedural justice, let's take it seriously. And that means accepting the possibility that actually the entire approach should change. But it's clear that, for example, the PCC has no intention of doing that. Getting to the question, which is about vested interests, which in our view drives all these problems. Glad to see that mentioned in Gaylor's presentation. So my simple question to Gaylor would be, in your view, who are the vested interests? We agree that they exist and that they're driving this whole process. But now that we agree on that, it would be useful to get a sense of who you think they are. Thanks.
And then there's a hand here. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Britta Renkamp. I'm a researcher at the African Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town. And I just have two comments, questions. So the one is for the first speaker. I just wanted to bring to your attention that under the projects that we've been doing on transforming social inequalities through inclusive climate action, there's a group who has been constructing a social vulnerability index so that you can actually see groups and how they are socially vulnerable to climate change. So that group was presenting in the parallel session this morning, so I think that's why I may not have seen it, but that's all research that's emerging, and that's also spatially mapped out, and a lot of that actually links also with the physical geography of the country. So that will be available for South Africa, Ghana, and Kenya. And then I wanted to, obviously congratulate you all for your work, and then I had a question to the last presenter, on the just transition, which is obviously a very tricky and contested concept. I just noted that you had an underlying assumption of how a state operates to manage a just transition, which is quite straightforward in the way that you would want to compensate those who are vulnerable, and that you would want to make resources available as a state function to cushion the impacts, which is what we see in the literature. But in the practice, we see a lot of alternative logics of how the state operates and how resources are allocated. So I just wonder if you would want to comment on that component of public funding and managing this just transition in South Africa. Thank you.
Thanks.
Firstly, thank you for the great presentations. I have a question for Nokwanda.
Sorry, can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, yes. Hi, I'm Snazo. I'm part of the team in the presidency. So I have a question for Nokwanda. Just in the interest of inclusivity, because you mentioned that, we have to be inclusive, etc. I just wanted to ask what you meant by that, some people are not in any types of value chains, because considering that South Africa's informal market is about 30% and it's quite a significant number, I was wondering what you meant by that, like they aren't in any forms of value chain, because I did some research and I found that informal markets are quite advanced value chains in terms of like how they manage the businesses, even though they are actually considered informal. So there's that. And I have a question also for Seutame. Sorry if I butchered your name. I'm not a trade economist, but then I was just interested. So you mentioned that the adoption of CBAM increases operational costs, thereby resulting in job losses. Yeah. So are these costs passed on to those who sell these products, like the iron, aluminium, these businesses? And in that's if okay, let me just read it out. Or are the iron and aluminium produced in South Africa not that competitive in the global markets? So South Africa is not a major player in this regard. So that attempting to pass on these higher operational costs would further reduce their competitiveness in the global markets. So it's just a question, because we know, like in the markets, when you increase costs, operation costs, then they tend to be passed on in terms of like in the form of prices of higher prices. So that's basically like where I'm going with this question. Thank you.
Okay. We're going to have to cut the questions because we are almost out of time, and I assume we want to get back on time with a nice lunch. Let's go to the speakers. I don't know if the speakers want to come up here. Let's take Gaylor first, and then Nokwanda, Seutame, and Neva can wrap up.
Can we use that? Yeah. Cool. Yeah, thanks a lot for the comments and the questions. So I think there was two questions that were targeted at me. The first one, I think, on vested interest for me, the first thing I'd say that what's interesting is that it's not clear cut. Okay, you can't say, well, when it comes to just transition, business thinks this way and labor thinks that way and government somewhere else and society. Like there's really a big diversity of views within each of the groups, and so for me that is really important to first understand that as a layer, and I think even within those groups you see that certainly there's some pockets that have clear vested interest in having either no transition or a certain type of transition, and I think we see it. Of course, it's not a big surprise on some of the fossil fuel industries, some parts of labor who are have interest in in having a status quo, but also some big parts of business who want to get into the transition, but not necessarily into the just transition. And so I think that is important. I think there's a lot of businesses that see benefits in doing a low carbon transition because it's to benefit, but the just part is less of an interest to them. So I think we need to get into more detail on that, but I think it's really important to unpack the different groups when it comes to those interests. And then when it comes to I guess compensation or the use of public funds, I think it's a critical discussion in terms of safety nets, for me, that we need to have. Again, if you go to the global north, it's not like they don't have impacts. They have a lot of impacts, but they have much higher levels of resilience for a number of reasons, and safety nets is part of that. yes, we always say, you know, public funding is limited. Yes, but we spend about directly as a country 2% of our GDP towards fossil fuel subsidies. You know, so that is a lot of money that we could be using for something else. So you know, that would free up a lot of resources that we can use to support resilience. Compensation is something that I think is part of restorative justice, but it is, you know, not easy to do, and of course I'm sure is highly controversial. It's not the only model, and I think we can, you know, of course we need to do that in collaboration with other stakeholders. But I think it's important that in that space, but specifically, you know, the public sector kind of, I think, leads the way.
Cool. Thanks, Gaylor. Thank you for the questions as well. So with the first one, I think what we need to think about is, as I mentioned in my presentation, essentially a redirection of the funds. So when you think about the auto sector, for example, and public transportation, what exists right now is a fund that's essentially available to help, you know, get new taxis to take out the old ones that are on the road. That's some of the funds that can be redirected, right? Even the incentives that are going to the auto sector can be redirected to then fund the move towards low carbon vehicles. And I am focused more on redirecting some of those incentives, because part of the concern for me is that if we don't do that redirection of the funds, then we are going to continue investing in programs that fund fossil fuels. So on the one hand, we're going to be saying we're trying to decarbonize while also funding those fossil fuel industries. Whereas if we take those funds and put them and redirect them towards low carbon technologies, then we can deal with some of those things. And I think there's also limitations to how much industrial policy can do in the absence of funds. So when you look at the DTIC budget, for example, I think there's more money going to funding the auto sector than the DTIC has a budget. And so there are limitations in terms of what funds are available. And you can't say to people, and you would have seen in Neva's presentation as well around small businesses, you can't say to people, go start a small business without the funds. And we know that the DTIC doesn't have enough money to be funding every small business that exists. And so we need to think about how to use the money that we have. In the interest of the time, I'm going to keep that to that level and then go to the other question around economic activity. So as you would have seen again in Neva's presentation around small businesses, generally Black women and so Black households are essentially not really there in terms of small businesses. And we also see it in the number of people living in households run by Black women that actually depend on a salary. There's more people living in Black women run households that depend on grants and remittances than salaries. So that's around basically 60% of those living in Black women households depend on money from the state and family members. And you can't necessarily say to those people, use that 350 rand that you have to go start a small business when the need for food is existing right here and now. And so we need to also then think about what are the things structurally that actually keep people, especially Black women, from actually being able to start a small business, and then addressing some of those barriers rather than saying use the money that you like. The ice cream story is nice, right? But we generally know that that ice cream story is not true unless that person had other sources of income. No one is going to start an ice cream business with 350 rand when they need that money to buy food. And so we need to think about also the stories that we tell to ourselves that are not actually reflective of the lived experiences of the people that we talk about. Thanks.
Thanks for the questions. So I think the finance question has been touched by Nokwanda, right? Around financing the decarbonization, right? So, but I think specifically coming back to CBIM, right? So, the tax issue or recommendation or intervention I mentioned, right? So, there are already discussions now. People are engaging if whether, for example, if you have to increase the carbon tax, once the carbon tax is collected, so should we channel that funding, for example, to decarbonization? Right, so that's the question. But I think the finance issue, I think, is being extensively discussed, and I think you've raised a good question with regards to that. So in terms of the cost or the competitiveness of some of this industry. So what you can see is that so I just only touch on the operational cost, right? So in terms of, for example, having the carbon border or the carbon accounting system in place, right? But there's also so what you see is that the EU is transferring the cost to the entities, right? So the entities has to pay the carbon tax, and once you increase or you pay carbon tax on your products, for example, considering that you don't have, for example, carbon pricing in place, so your exports will actually increase in cost. So if you're gonna send them, for example, into the EU, then now you're gonna be competing with like some of the EU entities that are already operational there. So your exports will maybe in a way be double the cost or something. Where now once the cost goes up, then your products become less competitive. So yeah, I think that's that. And just yeah, thanks for the other comment on considering the indirect effects of sebum. So yeah.
Thank you. Neva?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the questions. Look, I think it's important to look at the opportunities coming out of the green economy, but the thing I would say is the problem in this country, in my opinion, is people act like that's the only thing you can diversify into, and that can become distracting. So I tend to probably underplay it inappropriately. And I just want to say, I had an uncle-in-law who was selling ice cream, and trust me, he was making nothing out of it. And then he had a fridge with fruit pops, I believe. But I mean, this is not how you. I mean, it's true. If you don't have money and you don't have a place to sell it from, and you don't have good sources of inputs and all of those things, it's very hard to go beyond making literally pocket cash. The one thing I wanted to flag about cost is, budget's always about priorities. As you know, if you've been in government, that's what they always tell you. And I think it's also about who bears the costs and benefits and how able they are to mobilize to prevent change or for change. And one of the problems in South Africa is that we have these entrenched patterns of expenditure that perpetuate inequality and also dependence on commodity exports. And I think the question is always, how do you build coalitions for change? And how do we think about the political economy of what is possible? And I think those are the kinds of issues economists tend not to talk about, and then they wonder why their policies go nowhere.
We've kind of come to the end. There's no time for more questions. I don't know, each of the panelists, do you want 30 seconds to wrap up, or are you covered? You all covered. Okay, great. Okay, I think we've reached the end of our session. Sean, I hope that was adequate consultation for you and we ticked that box. Thanks everyone. Have a good lunchtime. I think the next session's at 3 o'clock.